She walked barefoot through hell, and smiled before the flames. They broke her bones, but not her silence. Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was just 18 when she was executed by the Nazis in the Russian village of Petroshevo during the Second World War. Sent as part of a sabotage mission by Soviet intelligence, she was captured, tortured, and finally hanged. What sets her death apart is not only its cruelty, but her refusal to break, even as she was mutilated, humiliated, and paraded as a warning. She died not in shadows, but before the eyes of villagers, soldiers, and history. The girl who would one day swing above the snow with a torn sign around her neck was born in the dust-scented streets of a Moscow suburb, where chimneys spat coal smoke and children traced frost with their fingers on cracked windows. Her name was Zoya, slight, pale, always watching. She was not the kind who shouted over others in a classroom, but when she spoke, it was with a gaze that made people still their hands. Her notebooks were lined with Lenin's words, but her margins were stained with dirt from the firewood she split after school. She was the daughter of the revolution, not in slogans, but in hunger, in silence, in the cold hands of a girl who had never tasted luxury and never would. The war came like winter, slow at first, then sudden, and then everywhere. When the Germans reached Moscow in 1941, Zoya was 17. Her mother wept quietly at night, and her younger brother began to sleep with his boots on. But Zoya did not cry. She walked to the schoolhouse-turned-recruitment office with snow cracking under her feet and asked to be trained. The officer looked at her like he might at a sparrow offering to pull a plow. But she did not smile. She waited. And he signed the form. They called it the Partisan Detachment 9903, but there was nothing orderly about it. The training was rushed, the weapons old, the uniforms mismatched. In the barracks, lice scurried through wool. At night, Zoya huddled against other girls on damp cots and whispered maps into her memory: railroads, bridges, barns. Places to burn. Targets to destroy. She did not speak of fear, though it chewed at her ribs when the wind howled and someone didn't return. Instead, she wrote letters home with trembling fingers, claiming the cold wasn't so bad. Her first mission was a failure. The barn they were meant to ignite stood in the center of a village already crawling with German patrols. The fire barely caught before gunshots shattered the trees and scattered her unit like deer under torchlight. She ran through snowdrifts deeper than her knees, her lungs sliced raw by the frost, her boot ripped open at the sole. That night, she dug a hole in the woods with bare hands and crawled into it like a dying dog, shivering beside a boy whose name she never asked. He died before sunrise, lips black, eyes open. Zoya did not turn back. When they regrouped, she volunteered for the next mission. Her superior officer stared too long, as if searching for cracks in her, a tremble, a falter, but found none. There was no fire in her voice, no boast. Just the quiet, steady flame that consumes without smoke. By mid-November, her body had changed. Her hands were blistered and stiff, the nails cracked and stained with old blood. Her face, once round with youth, had hollowed into sharpness. Her hair was hacked short and hidden beneath a coarse cap. When she passed a mirror, rare, in those frozen safehouses, she did not linger. What lived in her now was not glory, not even anger, but a sort of resignation sharpened into purpose. She had seen the hanging bodies of other saboteurs, limp from trees, tongues swollen, pants soaked in death. She knew the price. She walked toward it anyway. It was in those last days before Petroshevo, before capture, that Zoya began to speak less and less. Her comrades called her the statue, not unkindly, but with the all one reserves for something that does not bleed like the rest. She would sit beside the fire with blistered feet and frozen bread, staring into the embers as if memorizing the shapes they made: crosses, bones, rope. There was no screaming in her yet. That would come later. For now, there was only the quiet fire. The flame that had lived quietly inside her did not flicker when the barn failed to burn. The stable walls were soaked with snowmelt, and the matches refused to catch in the frozen wind. She struck again and again with shaking hands, until the skin peeled from her thumb and the sulfur stung her eyes, but no fire came. Only the echo of boots in the white dark silence behind her. The German sentry did not shout a warning. He cracked his rifle across her back without a word, and the sound of her ribs catching the impact was swallowed by the snow. Zoya fell forward into the drift, her mouth filling with powder-dry ice, and before she could scream, her breath was taken from her. They dragged her up by the collar, coughing, blood freezing in the corners of her lips before it could drip. She was searched beneath the pale beams of a flickering lantern. Her bag was ripped open, flares, rags, kerosene-stained cloth. Saboteur. The officer's face did not move as he read the contents like a death sentence. He did not beat her yet, not until they were back among the others, where punishment could be made public. The road to the village cut through a black forest and then opened, suddenly, into a wind-scraped hollow. Petrashevo was not a place of noise, just the occasional moan of wind against warped wood, and the soft, exhausted creak of lives trying not to be noticed. Windows watched from behind frost and lace. Doors stayed closed. But they saw. She was marched barefoot, first because the Germans wanted to humiliate her, and then because they no longer cared if she froze. They took her coat, then her gloves, then her boots. The wet hem of her uniform hardened into ice that scraped her knees with every step. The exposed skin on her ankles cracked within minutes, first white with numbness, then blistered blue, then seeping black around the edges where flesh had already died. She stumbled once. They laughed. When she fell a second time, her lips now purple, her breath coming in dry rasps, one soldier lifted her by the hair and whispered, almost kindly, "Get up or die here." But she could not feel her legs. She stood only because the next blow forced her spine straight. Children peered from behind fence posts, their eyes too large for their faces, their knuckles pale as ash where they clutched at frozen slats. One girl covered her mouth and turned away. An old woman crossed herself and spat. Another man muttered, which, under his breath, whether at her or the Germans was not clear. But none came forward. Zoya's mouth was bleeding. Not from a wound, but because the wind had split her lips like torn parchment. She did not cry. Her eyes, bloodshot and swollen, remained fixed on a point far ahead, somewhere beyond the village, beyond the men, beyond the pain. As they reached the center of Petrashevo, they made her kneel in the snow. The Germans removed her hat, revealing cropped black hair matted with blood and ice, and one of them pressed her face into the ground, not out of malice, but because it was easier than speaking to her. When he let go, her cheek stuck for a moment to the snow, and came away pink. The pain was no longer sharp. It had become something else, not numbness, but the slow suffocation of sensation itself. Her toes had ceased to exist. Her hands moved like someone else's. Her breath came in bursts, as if her chest refused to remember what lungs were for. She whispered something then, too quiet to hear. The soldier beside her leaned closer, thinking perhaps it was a name, a plea, a code. But she only repeated it, "It's still burning." No one replied. They tied her hands behind her back, too tight, the rope cutting into swollen skin. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked and was silenced. A church bell rang faintly from another village. The snow began again, fine and silent, settling first in her hair, then in the corners of her eyes. She did not blink. She watched. They did not call it a prison. It was a shed, a livestock shelter long emptied of animals and filled instead with a different kind of stench, the slow, metallic rot of blood left too long on wood. The musk of human filth soaked into straw, the cold, sour breath of those who knew they would not leave. They dragged her in by the arms. Her feet no longer moved. The soles were blistered, cracked open in raw petals of black and red, each step ripping skin from flesh like paper from glue. When they reached the door, one soldier kicked it open and the other shoved her forward, not hard, her body fell on its own, folding like wet cloth as she collapsed into the dirt floor. The door shut behind her. No light entered, except a narrow slit beneath the beams. From this slit came a pale gray stripe, like a knife laid flat, too dim to warm, too sharp to ignore. Rats moved along the edges, indifferent to her breathing. The first strike came within minutes. A question in German, repeated without variation. She understood none of it, or perhaps chose not to. When she did not answer, they raised the butt of a rifle and slammed it into her shoulder. The bone cracked, not broken, but bruised deep, and she exhaled a cough that sprayed blood in threads across the straw. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and smiled, not from defiance, but because she thought she might vomit and wanted it to come quickly. They kicked her ribs, not methodically but with the twitching rhythm of impatience. One of them grabbed her by the hair and yanked her upward, and the scalp peeled with a sickening tear, the sound not unlike boots in fresh snow. Blood streamed down her temple and into her right eye, warm at first, then sticky as it clotted. They let her drop again. She was chained to the wall, wrists high, forcing her to stand on the balls of her ruined feet. When she sagged from exhaustion, the manacles bit deeper, leaving purple ligatures across her forearms, the skin inflamed and split. Her arms trembled. Her legs gave out. She did not cry. She bit down until her gums bled, and the iron taste mixed with bile. They returned in shifts. Day blurred into night, though inside the shed, it was always cold. The wind howled through the gaps in the wood like a ghost trying to whisper a warning. She no longer knew which voices were real, the interrogators with their boots and batons, or the whispers that came from beneath the floorboards, murmuring in Russian, "It's your turn now, girl. Don't sleep." And she didn't. Every time her eyes closed, cold water was poured down her spine. Not a bucketful, just enough to shock. Enough to make the bruises sting and the skin twitch. Once, they slit her trousers with a bayonet, then dragged its dull edge across the flesh of her thighs, not to kill but to mark. The blood ran in narrow, red rivulets, thin as thread. She screamed, not aloud, but inward, her jaw clenched until her teeth loosened in their sockets. She vomited on the third day. Yellow foam and flecks of blood. One soldier stepped back, wrinkling his nose. Another looked away. Still, she gave no names. Still, she did not beg. One morning, or perhaps it was evening, for the cellar had no hours, they entered with a candle. It was the first light she had seen in days. She flinched from it. The officer holding it, a man with a waxed mustache and pink hands, leaned closer and stared into her face for a long time, his lips curled in something that was not quite a smile. He turned to his comrade and said something in German. The other nodded, then made the sign of the cross. They no longer thought she was just a girl. Something in her eyes, crusted with dried blood, unblinking, had made them pause. Her silence had shifted from defiance to something more dangerous. They had seen saboteurs scream, plead, urinate from fear. This one did not shake, not anymore. She had begun to hum. Not a song. Just one note, over and over, like the drip of water in a forgotten well. By the time they left, the candle was guttering. Her legs were covered in sores. Her hands were purple, fingernails torn off from the iron bindings. Her mouth hung open slightly, lips cracked and crusted with dried blood. Her body trembled in spasms she could no longer control. But her eyes were open. And she was watching. They brought her up from the cellar at dawn, or what passed for dawn in that colorless season. When the sky was neither light nor dark but a dull expanse of frozen ash, heavy and unmoving. The door groaned open, and with it came a sudden gust of air that struck her like a slap, clean, bitter, filled with the scent of pine smoke and old snow, and unbearably bright. She blinked once. The pain behind her eyes bloomed like bruises across the skull. She could not walk. Her feet, wrapped in torn rags long soaked through with blood and pus, had swollen grotesquely. Flesh had separated from skin in soft, wet bubbles, the toes blackened, the nails gone. Each step tore more from her soles, leaving half-prints of red across the courtyard's frozen earth. Two soldiers supported her by the arms, but not gently. One had looped her wrist through a length of rope, dragging her forward like an animal too stubborn to die. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled into the snow. A third soldier kicked her in the ribs, not to wound, but to make her rise. She did. She always did. Around her neck, they hung a sign, a plank of crude wood nailed together from splinters, the word arsonist scrawled in ink that had smeared with someone's blood. It hung low against her chest, swinging with each unsteady step, smearing her uniform, what little remained of it, with filth. Her coat was long gone. Her blouse was torn down the right side, exposing her shoulder and the raw, yellowing bruises beneath. Her lips were split and swollen, her eyes, once sharp, had swollen nearly shut from repeated blows. One pupil floated slightly off-center. She was led to the center of Petrushevo, the same square she had crossed days earlier, where her feet had first split from frost and her blood had soaked into the snow. Now, the ground was trampled, frozen solid, darkened by days of dirt and boots. A wooden crate had been placed near the stump of a felled tree. The noose hung above it, thick, coarse, stained from past use, its fibers stiff from old ice and rot. The villagers were already gathered. They had been pulled from their homes at gunpoint, farmers, mothers, children with red cheeks and crusted noses. Some looked away, others stared in silence. An old priest crossed himself again and again, muttering prayers not meant to save her, but to protect himself. A young boy wept openly, only to be struck across the back of the head by his father. Several looked at their boots. No one spoke. Zoya stood on the crate. Barefoot, trembling, filthy, she straightened her back as the noose was placed around her neck. Her breathing rasped in her chest, each inhale shallow and wet. Blood still crusted the corner of her mouth. Her hands, bound behind her, twitched with cold. One arm jerked from nerve damage, a reflex that no longer responded to thought. A soldier moved to blindfold her. She shook her head. Not out of pride, there was no pride left in her, but because she wanted to see. Because even in this body, even in this ruin of skin and will, she had one thing left to offer, her gaze. She turned it toward the crowd, toward the farmer who looked away, toward the mother who clutched her child closer, toward the officer who would write the report, toward the trembling boy, and she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, strangled with blood and frost, but it carried. You cannot hang all 200 million of us. For a moment, nothing moved. The wind had dropped. The snow hung still in the air, suspended like ash above a pyre. The soldier at her side blinked, once, then looked away. And then he kicked the crate. Her body fell with a violent jerk, the rope tightening, snapping her head back with a sickening crack. Her feet spasmed, legs twisting grotesquely, scraping against the wood post as her body convulsed once, twice, then stilled. The sign around her neck swung gently, bumping against her bloody chest. The villagers remained silent. One woman fainted. Another vomited quietly into her apron. A soldier muttered something in German, and another spat on the ground, whispering, Teufelskind, devil child. The priest crossed himself once more, this time without words. No one approached the body. Not yet. The snow resumed. It fell in soft flakes, resting on her hair. On her bare shoulders, on the tips of her blackened toes. The rope creaked in rhythm with the wind, and above her, the sky remained colorless, unmoved, indifferent, vast. The body did not fall still for some time. It swung first in jerks, spasmodic, uneven, the limbs kicking out as if still resisting, as if some final nerve refused to admit that death had come. The rope creaked with each motion, digging deeper into the skin of her neck, forming a deep purple ring that cut through the bruises already blooming across her throat. Her legs, bare and blue with frostbite, twitched against the post. One foot spasmed violently, its toes long since blackened and half-detached, revealing open flesh that leaked a slow line of pus. The snow began to stick to her eyelashes. And still, her eyes did not close. From a distance, it might have looked peaceful, a pale figure swaying gently in the wind like some winter scarecrow. But up close, the truth was grotesque. Her face was no longer whole. The bridge of her nose had collapsed slightly where it had been broken, her lips, cracked and torn, pulled back from her teeth, not in a grimace, but something stranger, a thin, unnatural curve, stretched by swelling and death, that resembled a smile. Children saw it first. A boy no older than 7 sobbed into his mother's coat. Another girl clutched a doll so hard the head popped free. One child asked if the woman was still alive, because she looked like she was smiling. The mother did not answer. She simply turned the child's head and whispered, "Don't look at her teeth." The villagers did not move. They stood like frozen saints, heads bowed, hands stuffed into pockets, hats pulled low, not speaking, not daring to leave until they were told. One woman crossed herself so many times her hand trembled uncontrollably. An old man muttered the Pater Noster beneath his breath, forgetting half the words. He glanced once at the girl's feet, which had turned a waxy gray, and then did not look again. The Germans brought a camera. It was a boxy thing with stiff leather corners and a crooked lens. A soldier unfolded the tripod with methodical precision, ignoring the murmurs around him, and set it down just feet from the corpse. He adjusted the focus, moved slightly to the left, and waited for the wind to still the body's motion. Another soldier reached up and twisted the rope until her head turned slightly, toward the lens, toward the viewer, and stepped back. Click. The flash did not go off. The cold had drained the battery. They adjusted and took another. Click. The photograph would later be passed hand to hand, not only among Germans but among villagers, and then, months later, by Red Army officers who wept when they saw it. And even further still, by artists, propagandists, schoolchildren. All said the same thing: she looked like she was smiling. But the smile was not joy. It was not peace. It was not defiance. It was a rictus formed by ruptured muscles, by torn skin dried stiff with blood, by a jaw that hung slightly open from where a molar had been dislodged during the final beating. One cheek was puffed and blackened. Her hair, clumped with dried sweat and matted with clots of scalp torn from the root, framed her skull like a black halo. And yet, the illusion remained. A ghost of amusement. A curve of the lip that unsettled even the soldiers. One man refused to look directly at the body. He muttered about witches, about eyes that do not shut even after the neck snaps. He had seen corpses before, many, but never one that watched back. No priest came to bless her. No cloth was draped to hide her naked legs. She remained for hours, swaying in slow, circular arcs, her body casting long, contorted shadows across the snow-packed square. Her fingers curled inward, stiffened by rigor mortis, as if still clutching at something unseen, a match, perhaps. A rope. A prayer. By midday, the snow began to fall again. Not a storm, but a steady veil, soft, silent, final. The flakes gathered on her shoulders, along her collarbone, in the frozen knots of her hair. They dusted her cheeks, melting slightly on her face before clinging again, forming a thin mask of white over the ruin. And beneath it, still, the faint trace of a smile. No one who saw it ever forgot. They did not cut her down. For 3 days and 3 nights, the corpse hung from the post like a desecrated relic, swaying gently in the wind, twisting with each passing gust as if responding to some forgotten rhythm known only to the dead. Her body no longer resembled something human. The blood on her legs had frozen into rust-colored rivulets down her thighs. Her arms, stiff behind her, had bloated and then stiffened again, stretched taut beneath the shoulders. Her dress had ridden up with time and wind, exposing her to the full cruelty of the elements, and to the shameful voyeurism of men who still dared to glance upward when no one watched. At night, the temperature dropped so low the rope itself groaned under the contraction of fibers. Her hair froze solid, black strands brittle and snapping in the breeze, clinging to her cheeks like spider silk. Her lips, once split and bleeding, had dried into a thin, gray line. The smile, if it had ever been a smile, was gone now. In its place remained a twisted expression of death that could not be read, neither peace nor pain, only the mute accusation of a face that had watched the village through pain, through hanging, through rot. The dogs came first. They circled the square with wary hunger, low to the ground, ribs showing through their fur. They did not approach at first, only sniffed the wind and howled once before retreating to the shadows. But on the second night, one of them crept closer, ears flat, tail lowered, drawn by the smell of decaying flesh and congealed blood. It pawed at the ground below her dangling toes and licked at the frozen trail that had dripped into the dirt. By morning, the snow beneath the corpse was dark and disturbed. Crows gathered by noon. They arrived in silence, perching on the rooftops first, then closer, on the crossbeam, on the rope itself. One pecked at her shoulder, where the cloth had torn wide and the flesh had begun to crack. Another jabbed at her cheek, its beak slicing open the skin just beneath her eye. A third took the piece of ear already half-ripped from frostbite. When the villagers passed, they looked away, not from pity, but from fear. The birds were messengers, omens. And she had become a warning. Whispers spread in the dark. The children spoke of her ghost, eyes still open, following them through the village. Old women made the sign of the cross and muttered prayers not found in any book. The girl's soul can't leave, they said. She watches. She waits. Some believed the snow that week was cursed, too soft, too quiet. Others claimed their bread would not rise, that milk turned sour the moment it entered the house. The square was avoided. Paths were rerouted. And yet, one woman returned. It was late, long after curfew, when the sound of quiet steps moved across the frozen ground. She was barefoot, cloaked, holding a sheet once meant for her son's wedding, white, thin, clean. She climbed the crate slowly, teeth chattering, lips moving with half-formed prayers. She reached upward, arms trembling, and draped the sheet over the girl's body, covering her chest, her face, her legs. She whispered, "You are not alone. Not anymore." By morning, she was gone. Taken. Beaten. Left with one eye swollen shut and no explanation given. Her family was told to remain silent, and they did. It was a week before the Red Army came. They arrived at dawn, their boots black with slush, rifles slung low. They found the square empty, save for the figure still hanging in white. At first, they thought it was a warning, a trap. Then someone recognized the body beneath the sheet, not by the face, which was torn and blackened, but by the shape of the rope, by the bones, by the hair still stiff with ice. Her name passed from mouth to mouth, spoken softly at first, then louder. Zoya. They wept. Not for the cause. Not for the war. But for what had been done to a girl so young she still carried a schoolbook in her satchel when captured. One man vomited behind a wall. Another removed his cap and stood motionless for half an hour, staring at the rope. They buried her with full honors. The villagers watched from windows. And though her body was gone, something in the air remained, not memory, not myth, but the taste of judgment, of fire barely extinguished. Even in silence, even after the rope, she had not disappeared. Her blood had seeped into the soil. And it would not be washed away. Zoya's death is immortalized in Soviet propaganda. Her name becomes a symbol of resistance, her mutilation a rallying cry. Statues rise, books are written, and the smiling corpse is etched into memory, a weapon stronger than the fire she carried. Yet for the villagers of Petrashevo, the memory is not heroic but haunting. They recall not a symbol, but a girl, frostbitten, bleeding, defiant, whose broken body marked their soil and conscience forever.